Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Great start to the day already. As already mentioned, I'm Gavin Shuker. But I will get out of the way to introduce our fantastic guests. Brilliant panel coming up on data innovation and security. And in this panel, we really want to have a think about what the next 10 years could be like. So it should be a really exciting panel with me. To my right, Richard Davies, who's CEO of AllicaBank. Mark Mullen, CEO at AllicaBank. Irina, Mnohoghitnei, head of the FinTech Hub at the Bank of England, who I've already apologised for messing up her name, so that's why she's smiling. And then Lord Holmes of Richmond, who is a member of the House of Lords. So I'm going to start with a very simple question, which is we're 10 years in, celebrating a decade. What do we need to do in the next 10 years to maintain the edge that we have here? And I'll come first of all to Richard.
Sure. So I think the last 10 years we have proven the UK is a great place to start a fintech. We now have quite a few fintechs that have reached real scale-up size. I think we've got to make sure that we continue the UK as a great place to start, but also we really ensure that focus on those scale-ups becoming true huge UK impacts as well as worldwide champions, and that must involve things like really significant market share being moved out of the incumbents into the challengers. It must involve listings for those companies. We need FTSE 100 companies that are fintechs, and it must involve that global stage, right? We must. UK's been a great exporter of financial services for hundreds of years. HSBC, Standard Chartered. We need these fintechs to be really leading that next generation of export of financial services around the world. So in terms of what's needed for that, I mean, there was the Unicorn Council yesterday that met for the first time, and with the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, a whole range of asks came out of that, but I guess particularly focused around consolidation of regulation, things like restoring entrepreneurs' relief, as well as things like abolishing stamp duty on shares to try and bring some life back into the UK stock markets.
Richard, thank you so much. Come to you, Mark.
It's interesting when you look back over the decade, because Atom was formed 10 years ago as well, so it just coincidentally aligns with the IFGS sort of anniversary. And ask yourself what's changed in that decade in UK banking, UK fintech, and what hasn't. And certainly a lot of good things have happened, and there's been a huge amount of FDI, of investment, and there's been a huge amount of if you like, innovation created in the sector. But there are a relatively small number of companies that are substantial and actually competing against the incumbents, the tier one incumbents. And I think it's time we understood why. And that's not always true about all sectors. So some subsets of the financial or UK finance market are more competitive and others are not. And so in order for you to have, if you like, a broader base of different types of banks and fintechs competing head on with the big players and actually achieving scale, what you really have to do is understand why certain breakthroughs are possible and others are not. And frankly, lending businesses have a great deal more more difficulty getting to scale against the tier one banks than non-lending businesses. And yet lending is the heart of the profitability of the sector. And so there's a clue there, which is why is that business model very difficult, even though that model is the most lucrative model, and yet actually some of the peripheral models, the transactional models, are an awful lot more possible. And so I think you've got to change that. If you're serious about competition, it's not just about more banks or more fintechs or support for more models. It's actually about bigger. And it's about creating an environment that allows companies to grow and scale quickly. And quick is not a word that the sort of UK regulatory infrastructure recognizes or feels very comfortable with. And I think we've got to move that forward if you want to continue to build a fintech story in London and the UK.
Thanks. We'll come to Irina.
Thank you very much. I was also reminiscing about what's happened over the 10 years, and it was 6 years ago, almost to the day, that the FinTech Hub, which I currently lead, was launched here at IFGS. So it's nice to have sort of come full circle. The FinTech Hub is a small team of FinTech experts that sits at the heart of the Bank of England, looking at FinTech policy issues primarily to do with artificial intelligence and crypto more broadly. But we also do tech experimentation, first through collaborating with the Biz Innovation Hub London Centre, but also through our own DLT lab to sort of try to understand how blockchain technology works before we sort of make any policy decisions more broadly. Also looking at the last 10 years, Apple Pay was just being launched. It was also 10 years ago that the Bank of England first published a discussion paper on blockchain and also Bitcoin and how it works, and it was quite a novelty at the time. Ethereum didn't exist. Cash was still being used as the primary means for making retail payments. So I think we're in a very different place today, and that's sort of to the credit of the fintech sector that sort of spurred quite a lot of innovation in the UK. For us, I think what's interesting to observe is the type of sort of proof of concepts and experimentation with new technology that has happened over the last 10 years. And it feels like soon we're going to be at a point where a lot of this technology is sort of going to stop just being used for experiments and start being deployed in various ways. And sort of in order to prepare for that, the Bank of England has done a lot of work to sort of make sure that we have the right sort of regulatory infrastructure in place to support that innovation and ensure that it happens in a safe way.
Thank you so much, and we'll come to Chris Holmes on the end. Chris.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm Chris. This is Nancy. Meet the government's new FinTech lab. See what I did there? There's plenty more of that. But what a 10 years it's been, really. And the greatest lesson we should all take from it is that we know how to do this. We should feel rationally confident. We should feel rationally optimistic and determine what we want the next 10 and indeed the next century to look like in this space. We know how to do it. The FinTech regulatory sandbox, an excellent intervention. Don't trust me. Trust the well over 50 jurisdictions around the world who've replicated it. Open banking, a great British creation. Again, replicated in well over 60 jurisdictions around the world. So we know what we need to know to make a success of this. We already heard from Philip on the previous panel around the need to change how we deploy capital, critically important. But for me, take 3 big L's away. Law, language, and learning. Law, the great good gift of English common law. Language, obviously the English language, just fortunate that we have that. And learning, one of the greatest higher education ecosystems on the planet. You put all that together and it enables us to understand what we need to do going forward. We need right-sized regulation. People say if regulations draw a brake on innovation or inward investment, well, it can be. That's wrong regulation. We need right-sized regulation. We need to legislate to enable innovation, inward investment. We've got the data protection and digital information bill going through at the moment. We've had autonomous vehicles. We had my AI regulation bill. It's a good time for, if you will, technology enabling innovation, enabling legislation. But whether one finds oneself in Parliament, in business, in policy, the critical point is to understand that we all have a role to play here, because if we're going to make a success of the next 10 years, it will come down to collaboration, co-creation, developing, deploying, and us crucially determining how we want all of these new technologies, in essence, tools, extraordinarily powerful, but tools in our human hands. We decide, we determine, we choose, and if we can go about that rationally, optimistically, rationally, confidently, there's no reason why we can't continue to have sensational startups, but also great scale-ups, and what I would call ultimately the unicornification of the UK economy.
Thank you, Chris. Richard, are we getting the regulatory environment right?
Oh, God, that's a long topic. So I think overall, the last 10 years, there's been a lot of good, right? You have to acknowledge that. Some's been mentioned already by Irina. I kind of cite on top the sort of challenger bank authorization regime, which Mark, Allica, Starling, Monzo, Oak North, many UK success stories have come through. I would say, though, and I think probably it's the same point Mark's making, that the focus on starting is great, but we need to focus on scaling and companies that make a real difference in diversifying key segments, key products in UK financial services so that you haven't got a sort of oligopoly of too big to fail providers. I think you kind of wind back to the global financial crisis. That's what everyone wanted to see. You look at, say, SME lending. I think that's a real rare success story where 60% of lending last year was not done by the big five banks. We should want that in all of our markets. And I think a focus on regulation that has that goal in mind is a really good thing. And I think there's certainly room to go to achieve that. And listen, I could cite many examples, but just to give two, I think firstly, the implementation of the Basel 3.1 standards, that the final drafts coming from the Bank of England in the next month or two is super critical, particularly so we don't score an own goal on SME lending that has been a success story. And secondly, I know this is being looked at post SVB last year, but the whole financial services compensation scheme threshold, £85,000, has not been looked at since 2010. There's been a tiny bit of inflation since then. And certainly when you look at SMEs and confidence in those SMEs having a challenger bank as their primary bank, I think there's something to be done there.
Mark, what's the one thing you would do to improve the environment for lending businesses?
I would properly resource the Bank of England. There's a sort of shameful situation at the moment where you've got too much staff turnover in the Bank of England and you've got under-resourced specialist teams. And it's not a mystery. And there's no conspiracy to try and make things difficult for banks. There's just not enough people to be able to provide the support infrastructure that allows companies to scale responsibly and sustainably. So I'm not sort of making a recommendation for hysteria, but as Richard just pointed out, if you want economic growth, the challenger sector is more than pulling its weight when it comes to lending into growth companies and lending into SMEs. And that's before you get into FDI. So that's the one thing I would do that I think would have the biggest impact. Properly resource the regulatory sector. It's not about whether there's too much or too little. You've just got too few people who can actually help you move your business forward sitting down the road in the bank.
Chris, if I can ask a political question, forgive me as a recovering politician myself. There could be some significant change in the coming months. Do you think that all parties are signed up to this agenda?
I think there's still some work to do across all parties to enable the majority of this to be really non-capital P political. It doesn't need to be big P political at all. There are issues around the edges, obviously, where things move into that space, but it really doesn't need to be, because what we're ultimately talking about here is optimizing our talent, optimizing the technologies, optimizing individuals, businesses, startups, scale-ups, communities, our cities, our country. None of that, in any sense, is big P political. It will be unfortunate if any of it does fall into the political space. But if we take, for example, what we did with the Electronic Trade Documents Act last year, the reason why I raise it is because I've variously described it as the most important act that no one's ever heard of, and the blockchain bill that never once mentions blockchain. But I raise it because it demonstrates what we can do, taking a very specific issue, doing a very small bill, and getting it through at pace in good order to show that we can actually legislate and regulate pro-innovation positively at pace for these opportunities. And we need to do more of that. We need to get a bill on digital assets. We need to get some legislation on AI. We need to look at what we're doing in terms of the capital markets. We need to look at what we could do in terms of dematerialization. We're not short of positive issues, but we need to be critically clear that whoever is the particular party in government, this is an issue for any government to get after, because economic, social, and if got right, yes, psychological benefits for all, but it needs to be absolutely not enabled to fall into that big P political space.
And Irina, obviously you see a lot of innovative propositions. Do you think we're doing enough to bring them to market?
So there's obviously a lot of innovation that's happened, both in the UK and abroad. And I think, you know, in the space of tokenized money, for example, we had, you know, the proposal from Libra and so on. It didn't come to fruition, but it did lead to an entirely new regime for stablecoins, both those that can be used at systemic scale and those sort of more broadly. We're going to start seeing a lot more sort of in this space. And the Bank of England, just like Sarah Breeden said yesterday, is incredibly keen to make sure that we really understand what type of innovation is likely to come into the market so that we can support it in a way that, that is safe. But then also in a way that enables really innovative business models to come to the market. And it's actually, you know, very likely that a lot of those will come from the very creative people that are in this room today. So that's, yeah, that's what I'd say.
Fantastic. Would you please join me in thanking our panel?